Hey, welcome back. As we dig deeper into the Creed, we're going to look at what most consider to be the most foundational claim in the Christian faith, the claim upon which the entire Christian system either rises or falls flat on its face. And that is the claim that on the third day, after suffering, after being crucified, after dying, after being buried, after descending into the realm of the dead, that Jesus then rose to new life. This is how the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 sets this up. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then you need to understand our preaching is in vain. It's worthless waste of time, just as your faith is. Moreover, if Christ has not been raised, then we are found to be misrepresenting God. We're lying because we're testifying that God had raised Christ from the dead. But again, if Jesus didn't actually raise from the dead, then He didn't, and we're lying. And so if Christ has not been raised, Paul continues, it also means that your faith is futile, useless. It's nothing more than wishful thinking, and you are still stuck in your sins. Worst of all, Paul concludes that if the resurrection of Christ did not happen, and in Christ we have hope in this life only, we, above all other people, are most to be pitied. In other words, Paul's point is that the resurrection is incredibly significant, not just for us as Christians, but really for the world as a whole. If the resurrection happened, the implications are significant. If the resurrection did not happen, then the implications are significant as well. I want to today dig a little deeper into some of the implications of the resurrection with you, and I'm going to start on a cosmic scale. Think about it. What most scientists argue is that in the end, entropy is going to eventually win. If you aren't familiar with the concept of entropy, it's this theory that argues that everything always moves from a state of order to disorder as energy kind of dissipates or spreads out through a system. And the only way you ever move back from disorder to order is when someone injects energy back into the system to reverse the process. It's fancy, but think of it like this. Your house, right? We all live in houses that are orderly, at least for a time, we call them clean, and then over time our houses will always move from a state of order to a state of disorder. Lack of cleanliness, right? Like disorganization. Now, as hard as we may try, or as much as we may wish it to happen, our houses never magically go from being dirty back to clean, right? The only way things move from dirty to clean, from disordered to ordered, is when somebody comes in and injects energy into the system to reverse the natural order of things. This also plays out on a cosmic level as well. See, what scientists argue is that eventually the universe, long time in the future, will eventually experience such a equal dispersion of energy throughout the system that eventually it'll result in what is known as heat death. That there will eventually be such an even dispersion of energy throughout the system that there will be no temperature variance. And everything will then result in what others call the big freeze. And scientifically speaking, the big freeze is the end of all hope. It shows that everything we work for, everything we care about, everything we try to pursue in this life is ultimately meaningless, utterly meaningless, because in the end, it's just going to stop. It'll eventually just run out of energy. But here's the thing. If the resurrection is true, it shows that God is at work to inject energy back into the system, to reverse the natural order of things that move from order to disorder. God is injecting energy to move from disorder back to order, to move from death to life. And this is exactly what we see the New Testament writers talk about. See, this is Paul again in Colossians chapter 1. He says, "For God was pleased to have the fullness of Himself dwell in Christ. Moreover, God was pleased through Jesus to reconcile to Himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through His blood shed on the cross." Again, catch that. According to Paul, through the death and resurrection of Jesus, God is beginning to reconcile all things back to Himself, things of earth and things of heaven. It's cosmic in scale. What the resurrection is trying to help us understand is that ultimately entropy does not win. Ultimately, at the end of the day, God will rescue the system, will redeem it, will reconcile it back to Himself and set things back from a state of disorder to a state of order. Biblically, the word for this, by the way, is shalom, peace, wholeness, completeness. And the ultimate aim of Scripture is looking forward to a day when God will fully restore the universe to the way it was supposed to be at the beginning. And the resurrection is the first glimpse of that. Again, that's actually what Paul is getting at. See, when in 1 Corinthians, as Paul begins to unpack the implications of the resurrection as well, again in 1 Corinthians 15, we see Paul describe Jesus' resurrection as the first fruits of a future harvest to come, or maybe think of it as like the first drop of a rainstorm. Even though you don't see the storm on the horizon, you felt the drop, and so you know something is coming. That's the idea with the resurrection of Jesus, is that yes, something happened, but it wasn't a one-off event. It was the beginning of something greater to come. This is why the New Testament writers latched onto this idea and not only looked forward to a future hope, a future restoration for humanity, for the universe as a whole, but they also allowed it to kind of pierce them on a personal level. They began to understand that if God is able to take us from a state of death to life, disorder to order, and he was able to do that with Jesus, then what's to prevent God from doing that again with us? Meaning that for the Christian, we don't believe that the ultimate end is death, but rather our ultimate end will be life. God will again re-intervene in the system. Again, this is Paul speaking to a church in Thessalonica. This is a church that really was trying to wrap their heads around the implications of the resurrection, and they wrote him with a number of questions. And so Paul writes back concerning the topic of death, and he says this in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13. He says, "Brothers and sisters, we do not want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of humanity that has no hope. Rather, we believe that Jesus died and that Jesus rose again, and so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him." Again, if the resurrection is true on a cosmic scale, it means God is reversing the natural order of things. But on a personal level, it also means that we can have hope to know that while entropy is not the last word, neither is death in our stories. There is hope as we face the grave to know that God is going to do something new, that God will bring us back to new life just as he brought Jesus back to life. And the reason we can have that hope, the reason we can have that confident assurance is because Jesus said so. Again, think about it. This is John chapter 11 in talking to Lazarus' sister. Lazarus has just died and his sister Martha is distraught about it. And Jesus and Martha have this conversation. And she goes, "Jesus, had you been here, you could have healed my brother." And so he goes, "No, Martha, don't understand, like, he's going to raise again." And she goes, I know. Eventually, there's going to be some future resurrection. God is going to intervene. God's going to fix everything. And Jesus is like, no, Martha, you need to understand something. Please hear me on this. Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who believes in me, even if they die, they are going to live. See, one of the most fundamental truths Jesus profoundly, boldly stated is that anybody who believes in him, even if they die, will live. Now, let's be honest, that's an incredibly bold claim. But is it any bolder than going around saying, hey guys, in 3 days or in a few days, I'm going to die, and then 3 days later, I'm going to come back from the grave? I don't think so. Like, those are incredibly bold claims. And what you see throughout the ministry of Jesus is him consistently make bold claims like this. But what the resurrection shows is that Jesus isn't just all talk. He wasn't just some raving lunatic out there spitting out crazy conspiracy theory ideas any more than he was some manipulative liar just trying to con people into believing in him and following him so he could feel better about himself. No, if the resurrection is true, it means that all those big, bold claims Jesus made have an infinite amount of credibility to them. Because again, if somebody can call their shot, I'm going to die, 3 days later I'm going to come back, and then bam, you actually do it, you realize you got to start taking him serious. And so if Jesus was right about the whole death thing, what's to prevent us then from believing Jesus when he says in Matthew chapter 5, like, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Don't think I've come to abolish the Old Testament. Rather, I've come to fulfill it. And think about it. If Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, it means that not only is Jesus credible, but it means that the Old Testament is credible as well. It means that all the teachings of the Old Testament, everything from Moses to Malachi, all of it was building to Jesus. And so if we want to understand who God is, what God is like, what God is capable of, we have the preamble, if you will, to the life of Jesus. the Old Testament. But even go bigger than that. John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. Or again, consider the story at the end of Matthew chapter 7 at the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus concludes and he says, anybody who listens to me and does what I say, they're like a wise man. They build their house on the sand or on the rock. And it doesn't matter what storm comes at you, you're going to continue to endure. The point is, in those bold claims, Jesus is saying his ways are ultimately the best way for us to live. If you want to really begin to experience the life God had for you, all you have to do is follow his direction in life. Another bold claim. Or consider this one, John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. Again, an incredibly bold claim that argues that even though there's a lot of other religions out there, even though there's a lot of religious philosophies, a lot of ideas about how humanity and God can be reconciled, how humanity and God can be brought together, Jesus says, no, apart from me, you're not getting to the Father. No one gets in aside from me. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one gets to the Father except through me. And according to Jesus, the way we then get into the Father is not by earning good favor with him, but through the concept of grace. By simply trusting that what Jesus did on the cross was more than enough to make us right with God. And we simply, in faith, believe that. We trust that. We pledge our allegiance to him. We look to him alone as our King and follow him. Again, these are all big, bold claims that Jesus made. But if the resurrection is true, if it actually happened, then these are the implications of the resurrection on a cosmic scale, on a personal scale, and frankly, on a societal level, in terms of the way that we live and move and have our being. The point I want you to begin to see is this. If the resurrection is true, the implications are significant. If the resurrection is not true, well, then the implications for that are also quite significant, because it means everything Jesus said is bunk. We can ignore him. We can pretend he didn't even matter, right? And so just imagine then removing Jesus from your religious philosophy. At the end of the day, you're really left with only two choices. Think about this. If Jesus is not right, there's only two religious philosophies about the future of humanity. On the one hand, you have many other religions that say one day entropy will not win, that there will be the God or the gods of the universe or whatever it is are somehow going to intervene and have some day of judgment or day of salvation where they will come and intervene. And again, that's kind of even the theme that Martha was tapping into. Like, I know there's going to be a future day of judgment coming or a future resurrection to come. There's a lot of religions out there who believe that. And according to those religions, the way you experience that salvation or you evade the day of judgment, if you will, is by being a really good person. Every moment of every day being better and better and better and trying harder and hoping beyond hope that you've tried hard enough and you've done just enough to make the cut, to get in, to pass the test. That's one approach. The other is to say those religions in and of themselves are also bunk, that they're just wishful thinking. There's nothing actually substantive to base your opinion on, and that at the end of the day, the only thing we have is science, and science shows that entropy is going to win. There is no hope. Everything we care about, everything we work for, everything we strive to in this world is ultimately going to fade. It's going to disappear into oblivion. It's going to no longer matter. Again, it's meaningless, utterly meaningless. Again, if aside from the resurrection, those are the only two future implications for humanity. So again, if the resurrection is true, the implications are true. If the resurrection is not true, the implications for how we live, how we perceive the future, how we engage our brothers and sisters in this life are also huge as well. The good news, though, is that even though for the last 2,000 years, the church has had no problem telegraphing its Achilles heel, no problem pointing out, hey, if you can knock this down, if you can prove the resurrection didn't happen, the whole thing falls apart. Even though for 2,000 years, this has been out there and people have tried for 2,000 years to disprove it. Over and over and over again, the resurrection continues to stand the test of time. More than that, what has become more and more evident to people is that the evidence in terms of the likelihood of the resurrection is actually far greater than the likelihood that it didn't occur. Now, I know that that's a bold claim as well, and I hope you don't just take my word for it. Just Google it. Google it yourself, like evidence for the resurrection, evidence against the resurrection, and sit in it. I cannot tell you how many times personally I have gone back to look at the evidence of the resurrection, especially in those moments of doubt or those moments of questioning, those moments of concern, where I'm like, is this really true? Am I just kind of like wishfully thinking that this religion system that I find myself in is just there? Is this just to make me feel better? And then I'll go back to the resurrection. And I cannot begin to deny, no, there was a dude who lived 2,000 years ago and called his shot, said he's going to die. 3 days later, he pulled it off. The evidence in favor of that is so overwhelming to me that even in the midst of my doubts, even in the midst of my confusion, in the midst of my questions, I find reason to believe. I find my footing. Now, as I close, let me share with you a couple of those arguments that I find quite compelling in terms of the evidence for the resurrection. The first is the simple fact that Jesus died on the cross. Now, I know that may not seem like a really big deal, but think about this. If Jesus didn't actually die on the cross, if he merely died or mostly died, if he just kind of passed out, right, and then was taken off the cross and then resuscitated in some way, you could begin to imagine where people would get this idea that Jesus defeated death, right? Like he comes walking into the room, he's all bloodied and beat up, but he's crawling into the room. He defeated death. Like you could see where that happens. The problem though is that the evidence tells us that no, Jesus didn't just mostly die or merely die, like he died. And the evidence we find for this is the fact that the people who killed him were professionals. These were Roman soldiers who were trained and experienced in the art of execution, who knew when somebody had died versus merely died. They knew it. More than that, had these Roman soldiers not followed through on the order of the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to see through the execution of Jesus Christ on the cross, they would have been held liable for dereliction of duty. And had they been derelict in their duty, they would have been open to punishment themselves. Why would these guys have risked their own lives for this random Jewish preacher guy that they had no connection with? It makes no sense. This is why, by the way, they then took the spear and shoved it in his side as a means of confirming his death. And if you remember, when they pulled out the spear, we were actually given also some medical evidence that shows that Jesus was dead. As we hear, when they pulled the spear out came with it what looked like blood and water. We talked about this in a couple videos back, but the point was the blood and the water was likely either the separation of the red blood cells from the white blood cells, it's possible it's that, or it was the fluid that had built up either in the lungs or in the pericardial sac. And when they pierced him with the spear and ripped it out, it was the fluids in those spaces that's coming out. The point is, these are sure signs of death. These are not things that you can fake. These are not things that you can pretend to ignore. Like Jesus was dead. Okay? So the first evidence in favor of the resurrection is that Jesus actually really did fully, truly die. The second is that the body didn't go missing. Okay? So some people argue that like they showed up at the graveyard, and you can kind of imagine this. Some graveyards are quite big, right? And like they got the wrong direction. So he's actually buried over here, and they go over here, and they go, we get to an empty tomb. He's not there. Oh my goodness, the whole thing. Like that's just ridiculous. Because the Gospels repeatedly tell us where he was buried. In the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, a well-known Jewish leader of the time. You could have looked up the records, walked over to the tomb, opened it up, and been like, guys, the body's right here. Okay? So we know the body was missing, but maybe it was stolen, right? This is another theory that people throw out, is that we know the body was missing, so it had to have been stolen because resurrection can't possibly be true. Well, play that one out, because that one's interesting, right? Because really you only have two scenarios. So let's say the disciples actually steal the body as a way of honoring Jesus, and then they try to convince people that he has actually risen from the dead. The only way you're ever going to pull that off is, one, you have to pull off the most epic Weekend at Bernie's skit you could ever imagine on a very grand scale. If you aren't familiar with the movie Weekend at Bernie's, they take a dead corpse and then they tie strings to it, they dress it up, and they move the hands, and they make everybody convinced that Bernie is still alive. And that's what they would have had to have done with Jesus, right? They have to show him multiple times to multiple different people as a dead corpse, and somehow convince everybody that this dead corpse was alive. Like, it's kind of ridiculous to imagine. Now, other people will go, no, they got a stunt double in, right? Like, they got a double, somebody who could represent Jesus. And okay, let's play that one out, because that's an interesting idea, right? We're told eventually that not only the disciples themselves came to believe in Jesus and willing to go on to die for this belief in Jesus, but we're also told of an interesting character in the Gospels who comes to believe in Jesus. A guy named James. Jesus' own brother. We know from history that James goes on to become the leader of the church in Jerusalem. But what's interesting is throughout the Gospels, we repeatedly see that James, the brother of Jesus, does not believe in Jesus. James is completely convinced Jesus is having a mental breakdown and actually tries at one moment to collect him and take him home. He's convinced his brother is nuts, that he thinks he's God or, the Son of God living in the world. And James is like, yeah, that's not it. And yet all of a sudden, somehow, within the years that follow the resurrection, James goes from being a denier to being the leader of the church. How do you get there? Well, the only argument is that James himself had to have had an encounter with the resurrected Christ himself. Now again, play out the stunt double idea. Do you really believe you could find an actor so compelling to convince your sibling, that you have died, that you have defeated death, that you are God incarnate, and that you have now come to live again, and you've invited them into a relationship? Do you really believe somebody could do that to you, to your sibling in your life, and make such a big, bold claim? Again, it's possible, sure, but likely by no means. Again, the evidence in favor of the resurrection is far greater. Now, there's one other argument that people often like to throw towards the evidence or towards the resurrection, and that is they just simply say the disciples made it up. See, the argument goes something like this. In an attempt to kind of elevate Jesus, in an attempt to make him look better, an attempt to kind of, honor him and his legacy and his ministry, they told all these stories that made him look good, even at their own expense. Now, as silly as that sounds, if you've ever been to a funeral, this is actually a pretty common human tendency. We all have a tendency in those eulogies, right, to make the dead person look really, really good, even at our own expense. It's like they were a saint living among us. We, for some reason, never told them this while they were alive, but now that they're dead, we elevate them. We do this a lot as humans. And so sure, in some sense, it's possible to believe that the disciples, in an attempt to honor Jesus, were willing to write stories about him that made him look really, really good and made them look really, really bad. That's possible. But where the argument falls apart for me is this. If these disciples knew that the resurrection was a lie, that it was something they fabricated, something they made up, then why is it that they all died horribly painful deaths for this lie? See, we know historically that many of the disciples experienced brutal martyrdoms. Some were crucified, others were stoned to death, others had their skin chopped off, others were beheaded, all because of their belief in the resurrected Jesus. If these guys knew it was a lie, if they knew it was something they made up, why didn't even just one of them recant? Why didn't one of them go, okay, you're right, we made the whole thing up, we were just trying to, make him look good? Or even play this out even more. What did they get out of this? Because other people could say, oh, well, maybe they had some good reason, some motive to do it. Okay, well, we've already experienced, they've said they got painful deaths. Did they get money out of this? No, the disciples were dirt poor. Did they get prestige and honor? Yeah, kind of. We do know their names, at least some of them, but we don't know anything about their family. So there was no lasting legacy for them to be able to experience. It didn't continue to benefit their family in any meaningful way, shape, or form. And so again, just play this out. What was in it for the disciples? Why die for a lie? The short answer is because they didn't believe it to be a lie. The disciples fully believed they had encountered the resurrected Christ. And in encountering the resurrected Christ, they began to understand on a cosmic scale that God was doing something new. He was reversing the natural order of things, moving things from a state of disorder, death, decay, to a state of life, wholeness, peace, order, the way he originally intended it to be. They also understood on a personal level that if Jesus could defeat death, and he promised that they too would defeat death, that it didn't matter what death they experienced in this life, it didn't matter what circumstances they experienced in this life, they knew that they had hope of something awaiting them beyond the grave. And so they could confidently face death without the fear or the uncertainty of knowing what came next. And so they were able to be bold and brave up until the very end. And finally, they understood that Jesus was highly credible. They understood that when Jesus made these big, bold claims, he wasn't a raving lunatic, he wasn't just some lying manipulator. He was who he said he was. He was the Lord of the universe. God in the flesh, and that His ways for life were not only best for us as individuals, but best for us as a society. And they began to radically transform the communities around them with the hope and love of Jesus Christ they experienced. It started with them, and then it didn't stop with them. They continued to share it. And my brothers and sisters, the fact that we're still talking about it today shows we are continual fruit of that original effort. Look, the point I'm trying to help you see again today is this. The resurrection is significant. If it happened, the implications are huge. If it didn't happen, the implications are huge. The point is you can't ignore it. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't just wish it didn't happen. You can't just walk away from it and say, oh, it doesn't really matter. Like, no. You have to look into this thing. You have to investigate it. You have to make a definitive statement about your opinion of whether Jesus Christ actually rose from the grave or didn't. Because as much as you may want to ignore it, the implications are too big to ignore. And the good news is this. When you begin to look into it, you don't need to worry. Because the evidence in favor of the resurrection happening is far greater, far stronger, far more reasonable than it not. Have a great week.